What is mold and where is it commonly found in people's homes?
All right, so mold is kind of a confusing subject, and I think it's where people get caught up a lot on, some of the crazy things that you hear about it. It's actually an organism. That's one of the term that mold actually means, and so it's actually a living, breathing organism, and it is constantly reproducing spores. Now, we also hear the term mold used for the spore itself as well. And that's where people get very confused because they think that, mold is everywhere. Well, no, it's everywhere that it's growing, right? And so you now have it as the spore. It can produce toxins called mycotoxins. And that kind of sometimes gets lumped into this whole, my house is contaminated by mold conversation. And so I think, we have to kind of break those things apart a little separately to really have a good discussion about it. Otherwise, it gets very confusing, very overwhelming very quickly.
Is mold always bad? Like, is there any safe type of mold, safe level of mold exposure, or it's like all bad?
I mean, essentially its function is to eat organic decaying matter. So we do need it as part of our planet's ecosystem, but we don't want it taking over our house. When you look at it from this perspective of it being like a weed, that grows inside of our homes, it's okay to have a weed or two in your lawn, but when it starts taking over your lawn, right, that's where problems start to get created from. So we don't want this taking over our house like a weed, and I think that's unfortunately what happens so much in modern buildings.
And it usually its onset is usually associated with water damage, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, as a matter of fact, it literally cannot grow in your house if there's not water damage or too much humidity or some sort of form of moisture. I mean, water is Earth's life source, right? You and I need water to be able to survive and thrive. So everything needs water, and that's where it starts here.
Wow, so interesting. Are there people who are more sensitive to it than others, or is everybody generally affected by mold exposure?
So I would argue that everybody is generally affected by mold exposure at some level, but I would say that there are certain people, the certain subsets of the population that seem to be more sensitive to it. Maybe they react much more quickly than an average person would. And that's, my entire career has been, kind of built on helping even the most sensitive people figure things out and improve the quality of air they're breathing inside their home. But there definitely, it seems to be some sort of sensitivity level between different people.
And mold it's invisible, is it not?
Yeah, because it's typically between 2 and 4 microns in particle size. That is very, very small, about 25 to 50 times smaller than what the human eye could actually see. So when we're talking about the spore itself, it is completely invisible. Now, when again, that gets confusing again, right? Because people are like, what are you talking about? I've seen mold growing on my wall. Well, 250,000 spores can fit on the head of a pin. So if I see it on my wall, there's probably millions of it already colonized there. Mold is a colonizer, so it's going to grow and then colonize, fighting over for the same real estate, which again kind of goes back to that water damage situation, right? So we have to have water first, then the spores that are already in the environment start to grow much more rapidly and much more out of control when the conditions are right for it to do so.
If you leave like food out, or like occasionally there will be like a cup of like what was formerly iced coffee that I just have neglected to put in the sink. After a few days, you see these like blooms like appear on the surface. Is that essentially what is growing in our walls due to water damage?
Yeah, it's exactly what's happening. So you know how you have like that iced coffee? Well, if you leave it out for too long, right, the spores opportunistically land inside that coffee. It's abundant with moisture. It starts to grow. That can happen in our walls, of course, if there's enough moisture inside of our wall cavities.
Wow. So how do you then, as an expert, how do you then identify the presence of mold in people's homes?
Usually various forms of testing. So obviously, one of the first things you'll probably hear about from any expert is like, oh, you can use moisture meters to detect moisture inside of homes. And that's true if you have an active leak. But it gets a little tricky because if it's not raining outside that day, you might not actually have enough moisture to pick it up. So it depends on exactly the amount of, when exactly you're using the moisture meter to determine the efficacy of it. You'll probably hear things like, oh, you can do mold testing, right? Well, not all mold testing is created equal. So a lot of people get hung up on that aspect where they're using the wrong testing technology to test their home. Let me give you an example. Most mold experts, or at least people that we think are experts because we found them on Google and they have a business, they come over and they want to take an air sample pretty much in the center of a room or the center of a house, right? What did we learn from COVID? Particles typically travel 3 to 6 feet from where they emanate from, right? Well, in this case, if I'm testing in the center of the house, I'm probably way more than 3 to 6 feet away from where the source likely is. When you come down to a room, even a 10 by 10 room, if I test in the center of the room, I'm really more than 3 feet away from where the source is. The source is going to be on an exterior wall or an interior wall with plumbing. So if I test too far away from it, it's going to make it look like everything looks normal. And that's because the test is designed to pick up basically isolated spores that are already in the air. It gets much more complex. Another thing we learned from COVID is that virus particles could attach to the dust already in the air and then travel much further than that 3 to 6 foot threshold. The problem is the testing technology for mold, it's designed to pick up particles that are very, very small. So something too big that's already attached to dust now makes it much larger of a particle. It's not going to enter into the cassette, which means that it's not going to be analyzed by the person who's analyzing the sample. So you're missing all of this data that people are looking for when they're actually trying to understand, do I need to do something about my house? How is the air quality in my house? That's why I helped kind of develop this test that tests the dust, because now we're getting a more accurate picture, because everything that's in our environment is going to eventually attach to our dust, become part of our dust, and then settle among surfaces throughout our home.
Yeah, the same way that iced coffee attracts spores that ultimately turns into the bloom that we associate with mold. These dust particles will settle anywhere. And so over time, hypothetically, I guess, and you've seen this to be, in fact, the case, mold spores will settle. And it's not as accurate then to do like an air test in the middle of the room, which is, I guess, what's commonly done.
Correct. I mean, you have to test, like if you want to do an air test, I'm not saying that air testing technology isn't used or shouldn't be used, but it needs to be used properly. If you want to do an air test, you actually want to test as close to the problem that you suspect as possible. I mean, I could even drill a hole in this wall right now and then pull an air sample from behind the wall, which would be as close as you could possibly be, right? And that would determine if I have a problem, growing inside this wall. One of the other challenges, going back to the moisture meter thing, you might have a leak that happened 10 years ago. Mold might have already started to grow and form. Maybe you fix the source of the leak, but that organism is not dead. It might go dormant. It might produce less particles in the absence of water, but it's not just going to die. It's like the cockroach of the fungus community. I mean, it's going to stay there and continue to produce particles that are going to continue to influence the air quality inside the home, right? And so how would I detect that with a moisture meter? I wouldn't, because I fixed the leak 10 years ago. I'd have to do an air sample and pull behind that to just based upon suspicion to validate, is there a problem? What species is it? How many, what is it actually producing? And we can measure that based upon the metrics of being able to actually collect those samples and analyze them.
Now, is there a threshold of mold presence that is potentially safe? I mean, I would assume that there are spores in the air everywhere at all times.
Yeah, usually what you do is you look at it comparatively to outside. So you're looking at an outside sample. I mean, most people, even when they're dealing with mold, I say most, not all, but most people will tell you, when I walk outside, I feel great. When I'm inside my house, I don't feel good. And so what you're looking at is what does the inside compare to from the outside, right? Because if you feel good outside, but you don't feel good when you come inside, we got to understand what's the difference there. And I think when you do that comparatively, you have to kind of know what you're looking for, just like if you were a doctor looking at lab results for a body or something to that effect. But most of the time, you're going to actually know that the outside sample looks normal. And, the inside sample looks way worse than the outside sample. Now, we know from that there are mold colonies organized, the actual organism. They are rapidly producing in here because otherwise the sample wouldn't be higher than normal.
Indoor air can be orders of magnitude more polluted than outdoor air. I mean, I don't know specifically with regards to mold, but I know exposure to certain volatile organic compounds because of lack of, especially modern homes are becoming so much better insulated as a cost-saving measure. There's, without proper ventilation, indoor air, whether it's exposure to volatile organic compounds due to off-gassing of furniture and the like, or exposure to dust, which, as you mentioned, can ride alongside mold, but also can be sloughed off of like plastic furniture and plastics and things like that, and contain, potentially endocrine disrupting compounds. Yeah. There's this whole concept of sick building syndrome, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Very familiar. Yeah, so the EPA suggests that, or states that they think, indoor air quality could be, sometimes 5 to 10 times worse than outside, even much higher potentially. And you'll see different numbers thrown around depending on where you're looking, but it's pretty bad, to be honest. I think it's way worse than 5 to 10 times. I think it's really, really bad. And the main reason, as you already mentioned it, these houses just aren't built the same way they used to be built. And part of that problem is ventilation. Now, if I build a very tight house, because I'm worried about energy, unfortunately, that tight house is going to be kind of like when you're in your car and you put the AC button on the recycle mode. You're just regurgitating the same air. Yeah, of course, it's conditioning it. It makes the AC work much faster. So that's the benefit. But all the particles that I put out into that environment are just being recycled. And people live in their homes with that button just constantly pressed in the modern building because their houses are insulated, they're airtight, there's no air exchange. And so the bacteria that you and I put out right now just becomes recycled. I'm constantly inhaling my own bacteria. Virus particles, constantly re-inhaling those. VOCs, formaldehyde, because we live in an Amazon world today, right? Anything I want will be in my house in 2 days. And with that being said, there's not a lot of regulations around the stuff that gets imported into this country. I'm sure you're very well aware of that. A lot of the stuff that we buy has high levels of formaldehyde, high levels of VOCs that constantly off-gas. We constantly buy stuff that has forever chemicals in it, right? Some of which leaches into our water supply, some of which we actually inhale, right? When we inhale particles, especially particles that small, I would argue it's worse than contaminating your water supply because you are inhaling it first. So it's affecting respiratory. Then you are ingesting it because these particles are so small, they bypass our self-defense mechanism and enter our bloodstream. So now we're literally affecting 2 major systems of human health here. Once it's into our gut, it's obviously affecting our gut, our brain, our organs, right? These are huge problems that we're not thinking about. What's crazy about all of this is it's completely avoidable. I mean, all we had to do was just know a little bit about air transmission, to understand that a lot of the contaminants we breathe, air transmission is typically the greatest route of exposure for human health. And it's just something we're not taught about. It's something we're not thinking about. I think we do a really good job today being aware about the supplements we put into our body, the food we put into our body, the water quality that we drink. I think societally, I think we do a very good job at that. But how often are we honestly, if we really be honest about this, how often are we thinking about air quality? Probably not, definitely not enough, but probably on most people, if you ask them that question, I think they're going to say not at all.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I've become really concerned about air pollution insofar as its ability to, enter the brain, these pollutants and cause pathology that, ultimately might cause conditions like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, dementia. And we know that, when you're inhaling this particulate matter through the nose, it doesn't, as you referenced, doesn't undergo the same sort of detoxification that an ingested compound might, like the liver can't detox something that you inhale through your nose, that is essentially an express elevator to your brain.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's super concerning. So what do we do? Like, how do we fix the situation? And also, what proportion of your concerns regarding, polluted air exposure is attributable to mold versus all of these other compounds?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the latter question first. I think mold is a very good common denominator. And I say this because it's a lot easier to detect with current technological standards. If my house has mold, my house also has bacteria, right? And so we want to be able to detect mold because it's a lot easier to detect. And by addressing mold, we're going to address bacteria and other issues as well. I mean, one of the other problems we have with water damage is just the off gas that it creates. Water starts to intrude into the building. It's mixing with all these different materials. It's getting them wet again. There can be VOC and off-gassing issues that start to occur from that water damage event. Because unfortunately, our modern buildings are made with a lot of chemicals, and there's chemical reactions that take place. So we have that aspect.
So you're saying mold is like the detecting mold is sort of like can be used as a proxy for exposure to other sorts of pollutants? Typically?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's just with, like I said, with current technology, it is a lot easier to detect. I mean, the testing standards are a lot just more developed. You know, VOC is a little bit more difficult. If I want to test VOCs, I got to really find a VOC specialist. And to be honest, there's not very many VOC specialists out there, right? If I want to test formaldehyde, I have to find somebody that really tests for formaldehyde. And most people, professionals, if you ask them to test for mold, they have the ability to test for mold, right? All these other things are kind of more secondary, that you really have to find a higher indoor air quality specialist that specializes in those couple different things. So I look at mold as one of the common denominators. You know, if you want to address, you know, and create a healthier building and alleviate these sick building syndromes, I think starting with mold helps you kind of kill multiple birds with one stone. And that's really what I think makes a massive impact for people, because you're addressing so many different things just as you happen to address and find the mold issue. When it comes to, you know, what do we do about this? You know, it's very challenging, right? So I have a nonprofit called Change the Air Foundation. It's a 501c3. One of the big things we're trying to address is actually policy reform. So working alongside senators and the government itself to address and change laws. We actually passed a law recently in Illinois through the House and Senate. We're on the last stop of being on the governor's desk of signing it into law. Part of this needs to happen because we need better regulations to provide people with better accessibility. I think accessibility is probably the number one problem we face with indoor air quality specifically. And a lot of that has to do with, you know, the average person not having the resources to deal with mold if they have mold issues. I would tell you factually the average person in remediating their house will spend somewhere around $40,000. The average family might not be able to actually pay for that. And so what position are they in, right? They're in a position where, well, they're going to have to clean aggressively. They're going to have to probably get air purifiers in every room to just kind of remove the amount of particles that are coming into contact with the body. They're probably going to have to open and ventilate more, open windows, open doors, get some fresh air, dilute the pollution, right? They might have to break their lease if they're renting, right? There are different things that people have to do. I think it all starts with being aware of the information, because if we're not aware of it, that's way worse, right? Because now we're the adverse effect of it, but we don't know it, so we can't do something about it. So awareness always number one for me. But then we actually need accessibility. Right now it's like, you know, I would say for middle class, upper middle class, it's still a struggle to like fix every problem inside their home. But it's a well worth it struggle, right? The problem is, if I walk around Section 8 housing in America, I mean, to see the conditions that they're living in, it's not going to be a pretty picture. I mean, I've seen some cases already. And this is where we really can do a lot better from a societal standpoint. And it starts with the government being aware of how big of an issue this is. And one thing that I think was really remarkable for me is, because, I don't know, I just, as a human being and as part of this great citizenship that we have in the U.S., I just always assumed that the government knew everything, you know, and they were on it, you know, they're working on it or what have you. Then I realized, by kind of being in the mix of things, the government's made up of people like you and I. They only know what they know. And if you and I haven't really grown up knowing about air quality, why would we assume that the government does? And they don't. And being able to actually talk to them and show them the studies that we're behind and all the information of how this is impacting human beings negatively, usually, because the air quality is actually poor in most places. I think they're able to see the economic harm that it actually has on our country. 85% of U.S. healthcare costs are consumed by chronic illness. How much of that chronic illness it is either caused or exacerbated by poor air quality? I don't think I can put an exact number on it, but I bet you it's a pretty big slice of the pie. And that's where I think, you know, we have a lot of work to do that could benefit just so many people. You know, I think it's the World Health Organization that estimates 9 out of 10 people do not breathe clean air. We're talking about 90% of the population.
Yeah, it's startling. How might one know if they're being affected by mold exposure?
I think the best, I mean, there's, so like I have the free version, right? The free version is like, go over to your toilet tank and take the cover off and flip it over and look inside the toilet or underneath the toilet tank. It's kind of like when you leave coffee out for a few days and you start to see a bloom in there. Well, if I see a bloom in a toilet tank, we're talking mold opportunistically is getting in there, and it might be because there's a source nearby, right? So that's, you can pause this episode right now and you can run right over to your toilet tank and flip it over and check it out. That is the free version, because what I started noticing, actually, this is kind of a funny story. I started noticing in all these people's homes that I've been going to that had significant mold problems, like their toilet tanks were a mess, like a disaster. They looked like you wouldn't believe, like they, you know, like the toilet was 100 years old and it just was completely overgrowing with mold.
You'd see mold on the interior surface of the toilet, or like on the water itself?
So like inside the water tank reservoir, you know, like the tank itself, that's where I would see it.
Wow.
I mean, like disgusting. Like it looked like there was diarrhea of mold in there. Okay.
Wow.
So I started noticing this pattern of all these different homes, like thousands of homes, all that had significant mold issues, all with people complaining of health issues, and like their toilet tanks looked like a mess. So, you know, is it to say that every toilet tank needs to look like a mess if they're not feeling well, if their house might be contributing to that? No, but I started noticing this pattern, and out of that pattern became, hey, check your toilet tank. Let's see what your toilet tanks look like. It's something free you can do right now. If you're renting, you can do it. If you own your home and you can't afford hundreds of bucks right now for proper testing, like you could do that for free, right? And so we always try to come up with a way to make things more accessible. How can people get some, you know, information that might not cost them, you know, so much? But of course, the dust test, like actually seeing what you're breathing using PCR technology, is probably the most accurate test that you can do to really understand what you're being exposed to. And it's all beautifully color coded to tell you, is it 10 times higher than it should be, 100 times, or even 1,000 times? And I think that scientifically can give you a good indicator as to what's going on.
Are certain geographies more vulnerable than others? Like, you know, is somebody who lives in, for example, a desert like Vegas at lower risk of having mold exposure in their homes as compared to somebody who lives in a damper climate like somebody in Seattle?
Yeah, so I would say yes and no. Like yes, when it comes to the mold that can grow from humidity. Like I would expect to see different types of molds in these environments. Aspergillus and Penicillium, many of those different species of Aspergillus and Penicillium, you're going to see them growing in, they don't require a lot of water content. So you're going to see them growing in humid places like Florida, or even in the Northeast, or, you know, places where maybe it's humid during the summertime. You'll see those start to grow rapidly just because of humidity. You won't see that much in the desert. But you also have, like, I don't know if you're familiar with like Arizona, but they have these like random times where this mold dust, like contaminated dust, just comes in and like sweeps through the like people can't like open their doors and windows during this time, or they're going to get like real, you know, everyone complains of health issues around this time. Everyone's closing doors and putting air purifiers in, almost like how people were freaking out with the the Canadian wildfires. It's just this weird phenomenon that happens where it sweeps through. So you're going to get, I think, different types of issues in different climates. You also have in the desert, you know, people using humidifiers, right? So they're trying to add humidity because, you know, otherwise their lips crack and they have cracked skin, and, you know, it's a nuisance. Well, sometimes people add too much humidity, right? They're trying to make it more comfortable, but because they're not in control of it, they leave the humidifier on, go to the store, come back, and the room is sweating, right? So you see people create issues that way by accident. I think you also have pipe leaks wherever you go, roof leaks wherever you go, right? That's not geographic specific. So you'll have different challenges depending on the geography you're located in. You'll have to build or modify your home with that in mind, in other words. But you're still going to have some level of risk with water intrusion.
Do we know do we have a general percentage of sick or water damaged buildings in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's going to change depending on who you ask. We just did a study at a Change the Air Foundation. We hired Raw Strategic and Industrial Economic, and the number they came up with was 47% of homes.
Whoa.
And to me, that is a very conservative number. and it sounds alarming. I think it's actually closer to somewhere around 75 to 80% that are going to have some level of issue. And that's mainly because we haven't been talking about this for a very long time. We've been making a lot of mistakes from a societal standpoint for a very long time. I mean, when you and I grew up, man, like our parents, our grandparents, they just poured bleach on it. They just painted over it, like, for really being honest. So think about how many years of improper remediation and just basically painting over mold has happened throughout the entire country. I mean, you think about this from a perspective of longevity and how many years this has been going on for. That wouldn't surprise me if you told me that 80% of homes had water damage. The largest study ever done in 1994 by John Spangler, I mean, he said that 80% of homes had signs of water damage that he walked into, that he surveyed, and then 50% of those homes had visible mold, right? We know that mold can be invisible too, and behind walls and hidden. So I think you really start to see the numbers, and it's pretty alarming. American Healthy Home Survey 1 and 2 was done by the EPA and HUD as a joint study. They did it first in 2006 and again in 2019. It's a 13-year difference. The prevalence of mold went up across those 13 years for 35 of the 36 species that they test for. So all but one species went up in prevalence. One of them even was in 100% of the homes that they tested in that 2019 update. It's not going in the right direction, right? And if we correlate that with our global health crisis, 60% of the global population dealing with at least one chronic condition, 40% multiple, like that also has been going up and up. As a matter of fact, we have never been sicker than we are today.
Right.
78% of U.S. adults are on prescription medication, right? And that's been increasing over time too. This is why I believe, if we do something about air quality, we should see some things start to correct.
Well, one thing that's confusing to me is that these fungal species probably predate us by millions of years. Yeah. So they're not new. How come this has become, a fairly recent health concern? Like, haven't we co-evolved essentially, for as long as we've been human with some degree at least of exposure to these species?
I would say yes and no. Two things. First off, one that you'll find probably pretty interesting is there is a mold remediation protocol in the Bible, the Old Testament. So that would be both in, for two religions there.
It's in the Bible.
It's in the Bible, Leviticus. Wow. Okay. So what they did was when they had mold exposure inside their places, they would go and clean it off and they would bless the place. If it came back, they would actually tear the entire house down, take the stones, and a mile outside the village, they would dump them because they knew that it could be contagious and contaminate other places. So that part's very interesting, right? Because it's like we act like mold is this brand new phenomenon, but no, we've been living with this throughout years. It's just we haven't. First off, history repeats itself. We forget things all the time, right? But we just haven't really. It hasn't been on our radar, I would say, in the last couple of decades, like it is today. The other side of things
also is probably not to cut you off, but as we kind of touched on earlier, homes are becoming better and better, insulated.
Yeah.
Right. And so
that's where I'm going. Right. Yeah. So 1970s, Richard Nixon's president. We're dealing with a global energy crisis. What do? Well, let's make everything more efficient. Let's use less and less energy. Well, how do we do that? Well, homes is obviously the biggest way they're able to make that change, and it's because they're able to control the heating and cooling loss. It actually goes before that. When we invented the HVAC machine, that's when it really started to become a modern day problem, because the HVAC machine any sort of HVAC machine is typically going to have some sort of evaporative coil built into it. An evaporative coil, it constantly condensates. It pulls the moisture out of the air, and then there's usually some sort of drainage system that drains the water away. This is true if you have a PTAC unit, central AC. Most of today's modern HVAC systems will have some sort of coil. Because it's just a place that constantly condensates, mold and bacteria love it. It's just a perfect breeding ground for mold and bacteria. Now, how do we prevent it? Well, we need good filtration systems. Many HVAC systems do not have good filtration systems because the manufacturers They're not realizing it's such a big issue. So you get all these side stream products, right? Like we've all, seen the massive amount of air purification companies enter the space and all these filtration companies enter the space. And thank you. Like we need that. But most people like you and I, or when we buy our HVAC system, the guy's not saying, hey, would you like to, a little bit more? Here's this amazing MERV 16 filter that you really should install from an air quality perspective. And by the way, it protects one of your largest appliance investments, your HVAC machine. Nobody gets that education, right? So what do we usually do? Well, we just go to Home Depot and buy the cheapest filter we could find because it's just a filter. And we don't realize the function of that filter is much more important. We're not educated on this topic. So therefore, mold and bacteria, of which are very, very tiny particles, bypass the filter and start contaminating and growing on this evaporator coil. That now is supplying mold to all of our rooms across our entire house. Some houses might have multiple HVAC systems, right? So it really has become a massive problem. And then to add salt to the wound here, we then started making homes tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And we're just living in this very highly contaminated Petri dish that no one's talking about. Except, well, I'm glad we're talking about it right now.
Of course. So how are filters for HVAC systems rated? MERV?
Yeah, so it's an efficiency rating. It's called MERV. And essentially, it's the higher the rating, the smaller the particle it can remove at the highest efficiency typically. So, for example, MERV 16 is the best filter you can get in a residential setting in today's technology. And it can remove particles as small as 7 nanometers in particle size.
Wow.
Depending on the manufacturer and the technology they're using that filtration with. A MERV 8, for example, which is, I would say, probably what most people in the United States actually have installed in their HVAC system right now, if they have a filter installed at all. That is not going to remove mold at all, like not even a little bit. I mean, all that particle is gonna bypass. You're lucky to capture a lot of the dust with a filter like that. And so there's actually a great MERV rating chart. You can look it up. You can just Google MERV rating, particle size. It'll tell you what particle sizes each MERV rating can filter out, and it'll tell you what efficiency. So efficiency is an important part of this too. If I have a 95% efficiency, it means it's removing a particle of that size 95% of the time. So that means 5% of the time, unfortunately, that particle is bypassing it. Nothing is going to be perfect. Nothing's going to be 100%. But if you get 95% of the time, now your HVAC is going to be cleaner much longer. It's much likely to get as crazily contaminated as if you didn't have a filter or had a poor quality filter. And you still want to clean and maintain your system, but you don't have to do it as much, right? So your maintenance cost goes down. Obviously the fear factor of these systems getting grossly contaminated goes down, and having to clean them, instead of every 3 months, you can have them cleaned, maybe every 3 years, right? And so you're starting to really be in better control for an upfront investment of putting in a better filter. And again, if we're not aware of that, how many people listening to this don't have that?
Oh yeah. I mean, I had an interesting experience this weekend. I was, so I change my HVAC filter fairly regularly, like every couple of months, every 2 months, 3 months. But I was not aware of these rating systems. And I was at Home Depot this past weekend with my brother, who just bought a house in Vegas, actually. And he hadn't replaced the air filters yet in his HVAC system. And I noticed for the first time at Home Depot that air filters have like these different ratings. Yeah. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. What am I using? I think they have their own proprietary rating system, because I don't remember seeing MERV. They had some other.
Yeah. Sometimes metrics. It's just like good, better, best, or like healthier, healthiest, I mean, they do all kinds of wonky stuff.
But my question is, does using a filter that filters out more stuff, will that ultimately reduce the efficacy and efficiency of the HVAC system? Can it increase heating and cooling costs, for example?
So it can restrict some airflow for sure. Like I use a MERV 16 filter that has the pressure drop of a MERV 8, right? And so you'll see that terminology, pressure drop or airflow restriction. The goal is obviously you don't want to restrict too much airflow. If you restrict too much airflow, yes, your heating bills and your cooling bills are going to go up, number one. Number two, you actually could cause damage to the motor, freeze your coil. Like you could ruin your HVAC system and create some problems. So you definitely don't want to restrict too much airflow, which means if you're listening to this, don't just go putting filters everywhere. Like consult with an actual HVAC person, but figure out a way to increase your filtration in a safe and effective way. That's the key. But I've had people where they install a MERV 16 filter at like the unit, and then they still go and install all these other filters like in their filter grills, like in their ceilings and stuff. I was like, no, you can't.
Yeah.
That's too much. You can't do that. You're going to restrict too much airflow. But trying to get a better filter at the unit, protecting that coil, I think that's where you spend the money.
Yeah. I've never considered the degree of filtration of my filters. I've just assumed that as long as I have something in there that I'm doing the right thing. But I'm definitely going to look now at this point.
Which means there are likely billions of other people out there that are doing the same thing.
Yeah, I would just order whatever was like cheapest on Amazon, pretty much. And I would change it regularly, but it is, and I'm sure that the manufacturers of these filters are, don't want to cause damage to their customers' HVAC systems. Like I'm sure they consider airflow.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's, just like anything else, any manufacturer out there, right? They're always looking to figure out how do I create good, better, and best, right? I think any manufacturer, that's their goal. Because they want to make a product accessible. The problem is that if you don't educate around that, that's where people can kind of get lost. If I think that the good filter is the same as the best, but it's just cheaper, right? I'm going to pick the good every time. That's human nature. But if I understand that there's a massive difference here and that when I buy the good filter, I'm not filtering out some things like mold or bacteria that I might strongly want to consider, that's going to make me second guess my choice of trying to go for the cheapest option. And I think that's, it's true for like pretty much anything. Anything that people buy, they're always trying to rationalize, can I get this same exact thing cheaper? Because if I can, I'm going to do that. But if I understand that there's a difference and I'm educated on that difference, now I can make a rational decision. You just said it yourself. I had no idea there's a difference in these filters. I just bought the cheapest one. Exactly, right? Everybody listening to this, hopefully, there are people that are out there that are learning for the first time. I do the same thing. I'm just buying the cheapest one. I had no idea that they actually mean something. Well, now that they know they mean something or aware of the problem, they could do something about it. They could buy a better filter and breathe cleaner air as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I would just look for the filter with I guess the highest rating on Amazon. That's pretty much it. Yeah. Man, the more you know. What about other ways to protect ourselves, in terms of home cleaning, purification systems and the like? Like I recently, I've worked with Air Doctor for a while. I've got Air Doctors in my living room and my bedroom. As I mentioned, I change the filter of my HVAC system fairly regularly. But what about like other, tools, tactics, cleaning methods, etc.?
Okay, so cleaning I think is very important, and it's unfortunately it's nobody's favorite subject to talk about, and it's highly underrated in terms of how it actually impacts our health. When we talked about we test the dust, right? And I just want that to soak in for a minute. If we're testing the dust for contaminants, pretty safe to say that there could be some gross stuff in the dust. Well, how does that impact the human body? Well, if you ever sat near a window on a sunny day and you saw that ray of light refract off the dust, for the first time you're like, wow, there's a lot of dust in my air, right? That's the first realization. The second realization usually comes right after that is like, I'm breathing this crap in, right? It's just constantly, it's everywhere. So if our dust is everywhere and we can test our dust for contaminants, and we know that most houses are going to have some level of contaminants, then we need to make dust like public enemy number one here. And that means that we have to make sure it does not accumulate. Now, I'd say most people do a pretty good job of, coming up with a cleaning regimen just by talking to people for a living. I'd say cleaning is like always something that's part of a program. But when we're being honest with one another, how well are we cleaning? I think that's always something we want to like analyze and audit for ourselves and be honest and transparent about that. We also have like thinking about our parents or grandparents and things of that nature. How well are they cleaning? And, If I go over to my grandma's house right now, am I going to see like an inch layer of dust all over the place? Because if I go there and I find that, then I know she's not going to be breathing good, clean air. And I know for a fact that with the mold and bacteria and the viruses, everything that's going to be in her environment, in that dust, VOCs, formaldehyde, all the things we talked about today, that's going to be breathing in her body 20,000 times a day. And the more that's there, the quantity, I think it really matters. If one virus particle enters the body versus a billion virus particles entering the body, where am I more likely to get sick, right? More likely to get sick breathing in higher quantities, right? So all that stuff matters, and I think cleaning is such an important, vital thing. And then there's a caveat to that too, like what do I clean with? Because how many times do people clean with bleach or chemicals? Because they associate that chemical smell with the clean. Just because our parents and grandparents grew up doing it, and we've associated that with that smell, that we think that it's not clean unless it smells like a chemical. Well, I'm here to tell you today that clean has no odor. If it's clean, it is odorless. If it's not clean, it's going to have an odor. It's going to smell musty, or it's going to smell strange or foul in some sort of capacity. So we don't need plugins and all these things to mask these smells. We need to figure out where the source is and properly clean it. So I think cleaning is not only one of the most budget-friendly things you can do right now to improve your health, but I think it's one of the most vital, because anything that could be happening in our environment that's constantly creating particles or toxins or things that enter our body that make an impact, they're going to settle and become part of our dust. And so removing that dust helps us exponentially remove the amount of particles. And I say exponentially because anytime I clean something, I'm only getting it about 80% clean. I got to clean it over and over and over again, right? And so you never get to a net zero, but you get pretty close when you're cleaning multiple times over and not, reusing that same dirty bucket of water. I just hear like my mom talking in the back of my head right now. Don't use that, swish around that same dirty bucket of water. Like, we have to clean properly.
Is it sufficient to clean with water?
You can, yeah. I mean, I'd say probably, even bleach is 90-something% water, right?
Well, you're right. I hate the smell of like chemical solvents and synthetic fragrances. Oh my God, the worst. Yeah. But in terms of using like some, a solution to clean with, water, vinegar, like. Yeah.
I use all botanical products. There's just no reason to clean today with the technology we have, with all the things we've learned and known and understood, with all the science that's out there. There's no reason we need to clean with chemicals today. Everything can be done with organic soap and water if you'd like. Everything can be done with certain essential oils, right? That help. And essential oils are great because they act as a degreaser, right? A lot of these chemical products were developed, and why, people fell in love with them is because they had different things, solvents being one of them. They also had like degreasing agents mixed in with some of these things. So it really was helping separate dirt and surfaces. It was helping to lighten colors of things to make it look newer, right? And so we can achieve all of those same things in different products using different essential oils, different organic soaps, right? To degrease, separate particles from surfaces, and then remove them. And I also use microfiber towels. Now, it raises the question of microplastics, and I hear this all the time, but unfortunately, this is one of the best things at removing super tiny particles from our environment as well. And that positive is so positive. We can deal with the microplastics using special bags to put the microfiber towels into our laundry equipment, right? So there are kind of hacks we can do to get away from the microplastics but still be effective at removing the microparticulate that I'm much more concerned from a health perspective about.
What about Swiffers and that sort of technology?
I think it's great technology.
It traps dust. Like that's
it traps dust. Yeah. I think it's a great technology.
Whole shtick, right?
Yeah. If that's what you want to use, you can go for using stuff like that. Microfiber ends up just being a little more cost effective typically and easier to use because you can reuse them. So they're more economical. But you can use Swiffers too. They work great. I would say Swiffers, microfiber, that's going to work much better than like a paper towel.
As long as you're trapping the dust, Yeah. And even if you're using a paper towel, make sure it's damp, right?
Exactly. Yeah, because you need to actually remove the particulate, right? And so it's really interesting, but a lot of people, when you actually bring to their attention, okay, if I have a dirty countertop, am I just going to like spray something on it and walk away? No, I'm probably going to have to wipe after, right? Like we all grasp that when we think about it from that perspective. But yet there are all these products and chemicals that tell people, no, you just spray and walk away and you don't even need to rinse it. It's good. You're fine. And none of that is accurate.
Well, I love it. So we've got some really actionable tips so far. We've got, make sure that your home is well ventilated, clean regularly, dust using a damp cloth or microfiber. Check out the MERV rating of your HVAC filters. Purify your air if possible.
Yeah.
This is all really, really great stuff. How do you know if you're in a place and it's time to move, like assessing, new properties or even staying in the occasional hotel? Is that something that needs a sort of guidance, like any guidance that you have with regard to that? Like when people, are looking to buy new homes, is there a certain, recency, in which that property was perhaps built, stuff like that?
So I'm going to tell you what I've done. This is like, speak to your financial advisor about this, of course, and whatnot, but I'm going to tell you a little bit of a hack that I've done that I've had success with. Every house that I've lived in has either been a foreclosure or a fixer-upper. And when I tell people that, they're usually like, are you really? Like, you would do a fixer-upper? Like, and it almost doesn't make sense, like, given the fact that, well, a lot of fixer-uppers and foreclosures, they have a lot of mold. What do you do about that? I'm like, well, I remediate it, right? I remove it. At least having that expertise has been invaluable on my own personal journey with me and my family. But to be honest, like, forget that. Even if I didn't know how to do it, even if I needed to hire somebody to help me with that, I would still do it every single time. And the main reason is because I get to open up every single wall. I leave no stone unturned. I get to see exactly where the problems are. I get to fix those problems. And every time that I'm done putting the house back together and make sure it's put back together properly, anything that I think, is going to die out in 5 years, like it gets replaced as part of this plan. I've got a brand new house with tons of equity because most people would not want to roll up their sleeves and deal with that. So they're gonna sell this house at rock bottom prices. And like clockwork, literally, this is my one house, two house. This is my third house that I'm in, and I live in Tampa. Bought a fixer-upper, put like whatever money I needed. I was actually surprised too, because when I opened up 2 of the 4 walls, exterior walls, they had to be rebuilt. Were like tons of termite damage. That wasn't part of the budget, so I got like a shock, like most people. When those HGTV shows, you're like, oh, what am I gonna do? Bringing it. But I just had to figure it out. I had to move through it, and now my family and I are in this amazing house that we really designed ourselves. We love the layout. We love everything about it, and most importantly, we know that it's remediated properly. We know that it's got brand new roof, brand new windows and doors. Like anywhere where water could be a problem, I've already addressed it. And I opened up every wall where water could be a problem to make sure that water isn't a problem. And I found tons of mold in that place. I mean, don't get me wrong. It was like everything. Every time I opened something up, cross your fingers like, we're going to get lucky. No, absolutely not. But it was worth it. And like, my realtor, when I bought the house from, saw all the work she did. She was like, can I list this house for you right now? And I'm like, my family and I love this house. I just spent 4 months working on this house and like dealing with all the stress that comes with that. We're going to stay put for a little bit. But like they're itching to sell it because it looks beautiful. It's healthy, like everything about it. And so just because I could do it, you might think, well, you have got this expertise. You know how to remove mold properly. Yeah, fair enough. But it's not that hard. It really isn't. And honestly, I think most people, they stay away from that stuff because, maybe they feel like they don't have enough confidence or expertise to be able to take on a project. It's typically 4 or 5 months, especially if you're doing it to the level that I did. It was like, just don't leave any stones unturned. Open up any wall that could be a problem. And honestly, if the numbers make sense, which they usually do in that marketplace, then it just becomes a financial decision of like, I know we can do it. We've got that 20% cushion of anything that can go wrong. We've got the right team around us. We love the place. We love the location. Let's just make it healthy. You can do that and have equity on the back end.
Are newer homes less likely to be water damaged?
So no, that's part of the problem. Because you could buy a house at the top of the market that was just built brand new. I actually, if you can Google this, I can't really talk too much about it, but I had a lawsuit in Tampa building a brand new house. So before I bought this house and gutted it and redid it, I was buying a house in Tampa, Florida, with one of the top premier builders in Tampa. And as I like inspect the house in one of the inspection stages, there was mold everywhere.
Wow.
Everywhere, all over the framing. So I'm like, hey guys, this is not gonna fly. And part of the problem is because most builders across the country, they don't understand mold. They don't understand the impacts that mold has on people's health. And they certainly don't understand how to build houses in a way that would prevent mold from growing. And it's really simple. Step one, don't put the lumber in the soil throughout, it doesn't matter time of year. If you put it in the soil, which is abundant in mold and bacteria, by the way, and it rains, that mold will start to grow on the lumber.
Wow.
If you elevate it out of the soil, like a foot, all you need, then it won't. Okay? The second thing is when you have what's called dried in. Now, dried in is a term of the house where the envelope is done and the framing's all up, the windows and doors are in, the roof's on, but you're also supposed to make sure it's dry, hence the term dried in. They're not going around with moisture meters making sure the water content in the wood is sufficient. And they're just going in and spray foaming these things shut now. And so they're trapping moisture behind the spray foam. Now you're going to get mold growth.
Wow.
And this happens a lot more frequently than any of us would even hope to realize. This is another change that we drastically need in the construction industry because, it's one of those things where people are moving into brand new homes, starting to not feel well. They're doing things like the dust test. And you're like, how could this dust test result be from a brand new house? You would think the house was at least, 20, 30 years old with multiple issues. And it's because of that. And so
you'd rather spend less on a home up front knowing that you're going to go into the walls, you're going to have to remediate to some degree. You'd rather spend less up front and reserve some of that budget for remediation.
Because then I can control it.
Yeah.
And then I get to design it how I want to design. So if you ever built a new house, going through that process.
Never done it, but maybe someday.
It's like, hey, I would love to paint this one wall a different color. They're like, great, yeah, it's $1,200 extra. Well, I would just love this molding to be a little different here. They're like, yeah, we could do that. Yeah, $2,000 extra. It's like, you feel like you're getting I don't know.
Nickel and dime, yeah.
It's nickel and dime for every little thing. Any change you want to make that's outside their customary, providings or offerings is extra. And, it's set up in a way where you could just go crazy and with upgrades and honestly overpay for the house just in the upgrades that they can upsell you on. So that experience rubbed me the wrong way too. So I was like, wait a second. So I was buying a house. That buying process drove me absolutely nuts and picking stuff out and being nickeled and dimed. And then to top it off, there was crazy. I got to test the house. I mean, there was not just like some humidity molds. We're talking toxic molds like Stachybotrys, Scotomium were growing inside that place. So then I had the mold issue. Then they wouldn't address that. We ended up getting into a whole litigation match. Okay. We finally settled so everybody can move on with their lives, but came out of that experience. I'd rather just be in control, because when I put somebody else in control, especially in the time period we're in where people don't understand how big of a deal mold can be and don't understand how this impacts their health. Well, that's like, driving down the street 80 miles an hour, my eyes closed, just hoping I stay on the road straight. To me, it's like relinquishing control.
Wow. So interesting. What about, I'm sure you're familiar with CIRS, CIR, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. What are some signs of CIRS, and can you talk about the ways that people are affected by mold? Both obvious and the not so obvious symptoms.
Yeah, so CIRS is basically a diagnosis that came out of Richie Shoemaker's research, who's a doctor, wrote several books on the subject of mold toxicity. And more recently, he's also been talking about the bacteria component that often can plague homes that are water damaged. There are, I think, CIRS or not, I think there are so many different symptoms around the exposure to mold and water damaged buildings specifically, that it becomes really difficult to nail. But brain fog, chronic fatigue. As a matter of fact, if you look at chronic fatigue really got born out of this outbreak in Lake Tahoe in 1987. And a bunch of people got sick. It was like this mysterious illness. I mean, the government came down. It was like a whole thing. It was like a very bizarre thing. What we learned out of that is, first off, Truckee High School in this area had massive mold problems. So they started looking at different angles. Could it be mold? Might it not be? In 1987, unfortunately, we didn't have the tools we have today, right? So there would have been no way for them to validate, was this mold? But looking back at it from my perspective, it looks pretty interesting to me, because chronic fatigue is one of the biggest things you hear people complain about when they're living in mold. There's chronic fatigue syndrome and ME, right? I did a whole presentation for one of the nonprofit groups there talking about mold and how do you identify it and how do you remove it. And it was like such a huge, topic in that community, because a lot of people with ME CFS, they're seeing mold in their body.
What's ME, mold exposure?
No, like mass encephalitis. Yeah. So it's basically like this lethargic chronic fatigue. You are, unfortunately, people don't understand chronic fatigue very often. They think, oh, they're just tired. No, I mean, if you go to sleep for 8 hours and you wake up and you feel like you didn't go to sleep at all, you do not get refreshed. That's really chronic fatigue syndrome. And obviously it can be acute to severe, like pretty much anything in the world. And you typically see that well associated with mold exposure. On top of that, you see gut issues, skin issues, brain fog's another big one. I think chronic inflammatory response syndrome, it's interesting because it's speaking exactly to what it is, chronic inflammatory response. We see inflammation with mold severely. And there's also the mycotoxin component, right? If I've got mold, certain species of mold can produce mycotoxins. Depending on the species of mold that happens to be growing in my house and depending on the quantities, gives me the likelihood of mycotoxin exposure at that point. Well, certain mycotoxins can be carcinogenic even. What's really interesting is there's a mycotoxin called mycophenolic acid. We literally make immune suppressant drugs out of that mycotoxin.
Wow.
To suppress people's immune system on purpose, specifically for organ transplant patients who need to suppress their immune system so they don't reject the organ. We make immune suppressant drugs out of that, right? So if we make drugs out of that because we know its effect, why would we want that in our home breathing in, 20,000 times a day? We wouldn't, right? But that's something that we know well of. Ochratoxin A, another big one, aflatoxin. These are all toxins that I typically see abundant in people's bodies when they're testing for it. And then I see the correlation of the molds that produce those toxins that are abundant in their house, sometimes at 100 or even 1,000 times higher than what they should be. So what's been really cool about this whole journey as technology has advanced, in the beginning of my journey, it was like, mold is bad, right? We should remove mold. As science caught up, it's like, no, we actually have the ability of correlating molds in your specific environment and the toxins that you are having a problem detoxing naturally from your body. And 9 times out of 10, you're seeing the exact molds correlate with the exact toxins in their body. That's what's been really mind-blowing. And I think as we start to see that science happen more and more, we can continue to collect data. We'll have the right data points in the next few years to be like, all these symptoms are caused by all these toxins, which are caused by all these molds, which are caused by all these problems inside the home. And being able to confidently say those things and know exactly what symptoms they're tied to over the course of time, I think that's what's going to really help us biohack our air quality to improve our health in many different landscapes.
Well, obviously cleaning up the external environment is crucially important, and probably the first step one ought to take. And we've covered some really empowering ways to do that. But what about how much in your wheelhouse is like the internal environment and tools, supplements, medicines, dietary patterns that might help to boost resilience, maybe facilitate the detoxification of mold exposure and the like. I know in the mold community, cholestyramine is commonly used. Yeah. It's a bile acid sequestrant. But yeah, can you speak to any of that?
So cholestyramine, glutathione, and binders are like the top three things that you hear about from a supplement standpoint that people are taking to try to, essentially detox. The sauna is like one of the probably biggest biohacking things you hear about is like going in the sauna, sweating out the toxins that are stored in your fat cells. Huge, right? Red light therapy has been another thing that you hear people commonly talking about and having benefits from. So I'd say like from the biohacking standpoint, like we see all those things and how they're actually working to help people.
And is it largely like anecdotal reports of benefits seen due to like light exposure and sauna, or is there like actual data there?
Well, there's data on all those different things, but I would say you hear a lot more anecdotally about people using it for mold, right? I think we all understand the benefits of those things. We've seen the science come out for those things. It's very interesting with mold toxins, just like any other toxin. You can attribute it to the same pathways of removing toxins. They're stored in the fat cells, right? The lipid layer of the fat cells. We understand that. So we understand that we want to detox. Here's the things that are most successful at detox. I mean, the data on saunas alone is like, it's really compelling. And accessibility is difficult because not everyone can, just get a sauna in their house. There are a lot more of these portable units, which is really cool to see in recent times. But yeah, I mean, like the studies showing the way in which human beings can detox, and we can apply those same principles to mold. Mold-specific studies, there's a couple hundred of them. I would say that it's such a new phenomenon in terms of people using it in the biohacking communities. I don't think we've had enough investments into some of the research mold specific, but I think we can apply a lot of the principles with the toxin because we already understand how toxin exposure is and accumulation and removing toxins from the body.
Would you say it's reasonable to expect a nutrient dense, whole food centric diet to help the body, better cope with these kinds of exposures?
Yeah, I think we're seeing in terms of diet. I mean, like Mark Hyman's food is medicine. I think I love that statement. I think we're seeing a lot of protocols come out for mold exposure, and you're seeing again more anecdotally people talking about having success with some of these protocols, and a lot of them are removing grains and any food item that could be contaminated by mold or mycotoxins. So you're seeing people say, hey, don't buy regular coffee. Buy coffee that's been tested for mycotoxins because you don't want to introduce additional mycotoxins into your diet if you're dealing with the exposure from an air quality perspective, right? Grains, wheat, we understand like the exposure for mold and toxins there is pretty high. FDA does its best to try to limit the exposure to mycotoxins. They do regulate mycotoxins in our food supply. How well that regulation is enforced is entirely completely different topic. But trying to make sure we're staying away from foods that could be high in mycotoxins. Peanuts is another one, examples. You start to see those diets kind of take shape. And a lot of the interesting evidence I've started to see is when you've got a fungal infection, like mold in your body would be a fungal infection, right? You're typically seeing other funguses kind of come out of balance, like Candida. A lot of people are having high candidas and they're going on those candida diets, having success with that. And then parasites, like we're seeing, interesting correlation with parasites for some reason in some of the recent research coming out. And I think a lot of that has to do with mold's ability to cause gut dysbiosis. It's one of the bigger well-known things that it does. And just that imbalance in the gut can obviously lead to so many other issues. Considering the gut's one of the most important pieces of the human body that we need to pay attention to.
Is it possible that some people are just completely unaffected by mold? Like, I don't know that I've ever been personally affected by it, but I'm sure I've been exposed.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, my girlfriend, Stephanie, she's super sensitive. She claims to be super sensitive, and she's, had all kinds of experiences where, she'll walk into a room. She actually, the first thing she does when she walks into an establishment, she looks at the ceiling to see if there's any observable. Brilliant, right?
Yeah, brilliant.
But there is a bit of,
I like her for you.
Yeah, she's great, but it's so odd to me because I don't, I've never had any noticeable, like symptoms, and I'm sure I've been exposed to mold that might induce symptoms in somebody like her who is seemingly sensitive to it.
Yeah. So you ever heard of like the canary in the coal mine, like how that works? Yeah. All right. So like the canary unfortunately dies to warn the coal miners that this is not good. You need to get out, and like the quality of air that you're breathing is horrendous. Okay. I find that people who are sensitive kind of act as the canary in the coal mine. But what does that mean for the rest of the people in the house? And I think that question is not answered at this point. I can't tell you the amount of times that people are telling me that, my wife doesn't feel well, but I feel fine, right? Okay, yeah, you feel fine. That's fine. I mean, how many times do people say I feel fine just because it's a normal thing to say? Well, that's good. Well, your wife doesn't feel good, right? So we want to help her, right? So let's come up with a plan to help her. We come up with a plan. And then when you talk to them in a follow-up appointment, that person who was like, I feel fine. Hey, listen, this might be crazy. I don't know, but I've been getting the best sleep in my life. Hey, I've been having, I was having these skin issues. I felt fine, but I was having these skin issues, right? And those skin issues have disappeared, right? We also don't understand, we really don't know how much it impacts longevity, right? I mean, we haven't been studying it as aggressively as I think we need to. To make a little quick point, I was interviewed on this show, Vice TV show, Brittany Murphy's death, and like could mold have played a part in her death, and it was really interesting. So
Stephanie used to lived for a time in that house, and two of my best friends, Craig and Sarah Clemens, lived in that home after it had been rebuilt for years, for like 2 or 3 years, and I lived in it for a time as well. And they found out later that it was like that it had, even after the supposed remediation and the rebuilding of the home, still had like water damage. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know Craig and Sarah too. Small world.
You know them?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. But yes. So that house, right? The people lived in that house. I mean, Britney Spears lived in that house, and that's like when she went kind of crazy and shaved her head. I mean, it's a very strange house. A lot of strange phenomena has happened, but people have seemingly gotten sick in that house.
But also, I mean, just as another, like I lived in that home for about 2 months. I didn't feel any.
You didn't feel anything?
No,
okay.
No, nothing.
But like, what if it took 2 days off your life and you have no idea? I mean, these are questions that we need to answer, right? Because the reality of it is we know that there are certain people that are like the canaries in the coal mines for whatever reason. And I don't think we fully understand that reason right now, but we understand that just this is what seems to happen. It's a strange phenomenon. They start to display symptoms almost immediately. I know people that claim they can walk into a space and within like 3 seconds, they'll tell you if there's mold in that place. And like, maybe statistically speaking, it's weird that it ends up working out that way, but like, there seems to be some sort of heightened perception, and maybe they've got issues going on. Maybe there's imbalances in the hormones. Maybe there's the immune system is like, this is their body's way of saying get out because this is dangerous. But what does that mean for everybody else? Like you said, you lived there for 2 months, you feel fine, right? Maybe 2 months it wasn't enough to like tip over your bucket. Maybe because if you think about it from this perspective, if I take toxins, which I do all the time, not on purpose, right? My body has to remove those toxins. That's just a natural part of how the body works, right? Well, if I am inhaling or ingesting more toxins than my body can physically remove, I think that's where the problems start to occur. So for some people, maybe they have smaller buckets, you know, and so their buckets overflow faster. They start to feel sicker sooner. Or maybe there's a genetics play because we all have different genetics and epigenetics, right? I think irregardless, my big concern is, and this, I always tell people this in the house, because there's always like 1 or 2 people in the house that's like, I'm severely affected, and the other 2 people are like, oh, I think we're fine. You think you're fine now, but the data just isn't strong enough to understand the impact that it has, even though you feel fine. Do we really want to take this chance knowing now that there are massive issues here to not address them? And that's a question that, you know, people have to really think about for themselves and answer for themselves. Sometimes people are like, you know what? We're going to do whatever we need to do because, you know, we want to support our loved ones. Sometimes they're like, we don't think we can address the problems here. We're just going to move, right? But at least with that information, they can kind of make these educated decisions. Now, for you, is Stephanie, you know, the canary in the coal mine for you? Is she helping you, or, you know, are you always going to be fine around mold? I can't answer that question.
Well, I think you bring up an amazing and important point that everybody's different, and that, you know, the resilience, you know, among individuals is different. And it's similar to, it makes me think of people who seem to do really well on carnivore diets, excluding all sorts of you know, quote unquote plant defense compounds, which are essentially toxins, but, you know, to a robust organism, these toxins serve as a hormetic stressor that increases the resilience of the system. But in somebody who's been compromised immunologically, or, you know, maybe they have a degree of gut dysbiosis, you know, that in that person, it actually causes symptoms and suffering, you know, in you know, some regard. And so, while I do really well eating a diet, you know, rife with these so-called plant defense compounds, and I actually feel like I gain strength from them. Somebody like Michaela Peterson or Jordan Peterson, you know, you give them broccoli or even something more innocuous like a sweet potato, and they have all these like symptoms. So it just goes to illustrate, you know, the biodiversity of you know, individuals, and how, you know, not everybody, due to innumerable factors, but ultimately modern life, you know, has different degrees of resilience, and some people are more sensitive than others.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my wife and I, we ended up getting COVID during COVID times. We had 2 completely different reactions. I was like flu, fever, in bed, sweating for like 4 days straight. Never lost my sense of taste and smell. She was literally working out every day, laughing at me, and lost her sense of taste and smell. So I was laughing back at her like, well, you can't taste anything. So yeah. But, you know, it's like we're so different, you know. It's like we have different genetics, different epigenetics. We have different diets even. I mean, we eat a lot of the same stuff, but, you know, if I'm working, you know, I'm going to throw something together where she might have, you know, make this beautiful, colorful salad or something, right? And so we're all going to eat different things, unfortunately, living in the same house. We're going to have different genetics and epigenetics. We have different behaviors from childhood too, different traumas from childhood, which a lot of the research I've seen on, you know, some of our cell memories and stuff like that, like traumas and how they travel with us through time, is very interesting, you know, and I'm sure that probably plays a role into things as well, especially if I grew up in a moldy house as a kid. I might be more susceptible to mold as an adult, right? So I think there's a lot of things at play and a lot of questions that we just don't have answered currently. All I can tell you is that, you know, I might not know all the different ways from a totality perspective of how the work I'm doing is important. But I can tell you that just by seeing people's transformations over the last decade, helping thousands of people like improve from acute stuff to just like I sleep better, to like I was literally on a GJ feeding tube about to die bedbound 95% of the time, and I'm like thriving again. Like I've seen everything from extreme to acute and everything in between. I can tell you that there is something here. Like there is something here. And I think when you look at all the science and all the data, it makes a lot of sense. Cancer Research UK just said 10% of all cancer cases are from air pollution now, wow, which is like the second leading cause of cancer next to smoking cigarettes. Like the data is starting to come out and it's starting to be more and more remarkable. I think it's really important that we pay attention, because a lot of us are biohacking and doing all the things right. But this is something that you're breathing all the time. You can't go more than a few minutes without breathing. And it's just not thought of. And this is something we should be adding to our biohacking regimens.
I couldn't agree more. Well, I definitely appreciate the work that you do, and I know Stephanie does. She's a huge fan, and you are helping a ton of people. So thank you. What resources exist for people that want to learn more about this stuff and find out more about your work?
Yeah, so I'd say like number one, go to changetheairfoundation.org, because I put together tons and tons and tons of free resources that exist on that website. All the research and studies that have been coming out as of lately are located there. The paper I mentioned that we did with Raw Strategic, and it's basically it's for the first time we're addressing the economic harm that this is all causing us. And we did it mainly to give to the government and help push them along in changing laws. So I'd say going there first is a great way to look at all the information. And if you need help with your own home, you can go to homecleanse.com. So that's a company I founded that actually addresses, water damage in people's homes scientifically and helps them put together plans of taking the next steps. And then the michaelrubino.com is if you just want to learn more about me, professionally, or sometimes I will do consults with people as well, and they can go there and work with me one-on-one to try to figure that out. I can't promise I'm gonna do that stuff forever, because I'm doing a lot at once, but for right now I'm still doing them.
Love it. Awesome, man. Well, thanks for coming in. And last question that gets asked everybody on the show: what does living a genius life mean to you?
Well, for me, I think, I don't consider myself a genius at all. But I've become a genius in my own way, in terms of figuring out how do I improve what's going in and on my body. And obviously air quality is something that has such a profound thing that's been lacking, that I've seen. But to be honest, like I'm still learning, what healthy looks like for me too. It's like I've got air quality checked up, right? I think I've had probably gut dysbiosis from walking into people's homes for 10 years and being in crazy places. It's a lot of exposure. I think for me, being a genius is just always being willing to learn. And I think there's always new information, new studies that come out that I'm always willing to learn. And I don't get hard set in my ways. And I love, listening to podcasts like yours and learning from other experts from various fields, because I think what I don't know, I'm not going to know as profoundly as they do, because they're studying it every day. And I think being able to take all that information from all these different places, that's a real way to level up in life. And so that's what I think genius means to me. And
I love that. Yeah, you do have to protect yourself. I was at a wonderful conference. I got to moderate a panel at the Brain and Environment Symposium in DC recently, and I was on the panel with me was a Parkinson's disease researcher he's a neurologist and scientist, and he's done a lot of work exposing the link between a certain pesticide, I believe it was Rubino, and Parkinson's disease. Wow. And he's published on this extensively, but his exposure to this chemical, because he's been studying it for the entirety of his career, he developed Parkinson's disease, and he believes it was as a result of his exposure to it, because of his interest in his academic work in exposing the connection between this herbicide and Parkinson's disease, and he now has Parkinson's disease. Yeah. So it's just a testament to the work that you're doing is so crucially important, but you do want to make sure that you're protecting yourself all the while.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually absolutely right. I mean, there's so many things we can be exposed to in our environment, and I think just being aware of that is step one, because if it's not mold, if it's not bacteria, there are chemicals and there are other things that we can be introducing into our home in a way to solve other problems, right?
Yeah.
If I'm using a rat chemical, I'm trying to solve a rat problem, right? And so, unfortunately, what's the effect of that? These are things we don't normally think about, because we just assume that if it exists, it's safe. And that just isn't true.
It's not true. It's definitely not true. Well, thanks for coming in, Michael. You're the man.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.